1923. Drought was biting deep into the bones of Elk Hollow, a half-forgotten hamlet wallowed by the wind-scoured plateaus of eastern Wyoming. Most folks who had anything worth hauling had left by spring, leaving behind sun-bleached fence posts and empty water tanks that sang in the wind like ghosts whispering of better years. The land, once full with wheat and cattle, had gone brittle, cracking open like a forgotten promise. It was late afternoon, and the light had taken on that copper tint that made everything look older than it was. Dust hung like smoke in the still air, coating the world in a fine, choking silence. Joetta Mars stood outside what was left of her father's house, the wooden boards warped and bowing with age. The front door leaned on broken hinges. Inside, everything echoed too much. Her shoes were cracked at the sides, her skirts fraying at the hem, her cheeks drawn tighter with each day she failed to find work. Her hands were blistered from fencing wire and washing strangers' floors, and she hadn't eaten since the day before. But none of that ached like the silence that followed the child's whisper, "Mom, I'm hungry." The mess voice had barely lifted above her breath, but it had struck Joetta like a bell rung deep in the earth. She turned her head slowly, not sure whether she had imagined it, then saw him. Her boy, all of 5 years old, sitting cross-legged in the shadow of the porch, trying to stay small, his cheeks hollow, one shoelace missing, sunburn peeling from the tops of his ears. She knelt in the dust, pulled him to her chest, held him longer than she should have, longer than he understood. He said nothing more, didn't cry. He was learning how to starve without complaint. There was a time she would raged, kicked at the earth, shouted at the sky. But the shouting had stopped when her husband didn't come back. First, just a long trip to Cheyenne, then a month, then 2. She had stopped counting after the 10th letter went unanswered. Now there was no one to shout to, no one to shout for. So she rose, kissed Clem's forehead, told him to stay put, not to touch the water bucket unless he had to. Then she started walking west down the dirt road, past the gate where the sign had long since rotted off, heading toward a property she had only heard of in passing. Rumor said the man out there still ran cattle. Rumor said he was mean as a snake, lived alone, didn't talk to no one. But he had water, and she needed work. She had no other direction to walk in. It was 7 miles by guess. The road flickered and he triples like a mirage. Her throat grew tight with thirst. Her boots rubbed blisters, then blood. She passed a sun-bleached steer skeleton, angled and tumbleweed, and didn't flinch. When she reached the gate, the sun was already sinking low, dipping toward the hills like a dying coal. There was a ranch sign nailed high to 2 leaning posts far in. The wind tore at the grass below, what little there was of it. A windmill creaked in the distance, spinning slow. Joetta placed a hand on the gate, hesitated, then pushed it open with a metal groan. The ranch house wasn't much. A squat, low-roofed thing that looked carved into the dust itself. Beside it, the barn door hung askew. A single horse, ribs sharp beneath its hide, stood tethered beneath a makeshift lean-to, chewing slow. Then the screen door slammed. He stepped out like he hadn't heard her, but she knew better. A tall man, sun-browned skin, wide shoulders hunched slightly like he carried something heavy and invisible. Maybe he did. His hat shaded his eyes. He had a rifle in one hand, a rag in the other. Wiped the metal slow. Said nothing. Joetta didn't speak right away either. They stood that way a moment, the silence between them thicker than the dust. Finally she swallowed and said, "IINT here for charity." That got a flicker in his eye. Not quite a smile, just something human. "I got a boy," she added, "and I can work. I clean, mend, cook some. Don't scare easy." He didn't blink, just said, "You bring the boy?" "No," she answered. "Didn't know if he'd be coming back." He nodded. "Once." Then he stepped aside, left the door open behind him, and went back inside without a word. She stood there a second longer, heart hammering in her ribs like a wild thing trying to get out. Then she stepped through the door. The ranch house smelled of dust, smoke, and something half-burned on the stove. A metal pot sat unattended, still warm but crusted at the edges. The floorboards groaned under Joetta's weight as she stepped into the main room. A small fire snapped low in the hearth. Beside it, A cot sat folded against the wall, and a threadbare quilt laid draped over the arm of a chair carved by hand. Rough wood, honest work. He didn't offer her a seat, just returned to the table, set the rifle down beside a half-sliced potato, and went on peeling like she was there. Joetta stood still, listening to the silence between his movements. The rasp of the knife, the soft creak of the wind outside. Her mouth was dry, but pride kept her from asking for water. He knew. She could see that in the way he moved slower now, giving her space to speak if she wanted. She didn't. Instead, her eyes drifted to a photograph on the mantel. A woman, maybe 30, with dark hair tied back neat and calm eyes that didn't quite smile. Next to her, a boy, 10, maybe 11, both weird, dressed for town. The frame had dust in its corners, but the glass had been clean. Joetta turned away. "I can mend that barn door," she said. "And your fence. I passed the spots near falling." The man finally looked up, eyes level and readable. "Name's Eli." He paused. "That fence line eastern side?" She nodded. "Cattle been slipping past there all summer." He didn't thank her. Just leaned back in his chair, the knife still in his hand. "Why were you really here?" he asked. Joetta didn't flinch. "My boy's hungry. That was it. No story about the husband who left. No tale of bad harvests or the way the bank man had stopped being polite. Just the truth that mattered." Eli looked past her toward the door. "Bring him tomorrow," he said finally. "If you're staying, he stays." Then he stood and walked into the back room without looking back. She heard the squeak of springs as he dropped onto his bed. Joetta sat down slow, letting her body remember it didn't have to hold itself so tight. Her legs ached, her shoulders burned, and her eyes, damn them, they watered without asking. She wiped her face with the edge of her sleeve, then stood. Quietly she gathered the potatoes and finished slicing, put them back on the stove, added a splash of water, and covered the pot. She found a blanket in a chest under the window and laid herself on the floor beside the fire. No pillow, but the warmth was enough. And in that dark room, in that quiet house on the edge of the world, Joetta closed her eyes and tried not to dream of the life she'd come from. But the past comes easy in the dark. She saw Cal again, her husband, leaning in the doorway that first spring, boots dusty, eyes laughing as he handed her the ring. Said it was thin, but it would hold. Said everything would hold. Chet believed him. H.E.D. had big dreams, always chasing something that wasn't there yet. He wanted to run cattle, wanted a place of his own. But the land turned mean, and the work got harder, and his smiles got thin. The day he left for Cheyenne, he kissed her cheek and said H.E.D. back into weeks with seed money and a second-hand plow. That was 11 months ago. She never knew if it was the bottle that took him, or a woman with easier eyes, or if the land just swallowed him up like it did so many others. All she knew was that he didn't come back, and winter didn't wait. In the stillness, Joetta turned on her side and curled tighter. Tomorrow she would walk back and get Clem. She'd carry him if she had to. But tonight she would rest in a stranger's house, beside a fire she hadn't built, under a roof that was hers. And for the first time in a long time, her son was the only sound in her world. Subscribe, and let the journey keep unfolding. Joetta rose before the sun. Her muscles still ached, and her mouth tasted like ash. But she moved quick, folding the blanket and setting the pot on the back of the stove to keep warm. Eli hadn't stirred. She didn't expect him to. She stepped outside into the still blue of pre-dawn. Frost laced the ground like brittle lace. Her breath hung in the air. She didn't wait for permission, just turned and started back east down the road, feet dragging through dust and memory. She found Clem huddled beneath the porch blanket, curled like a seed. His face was pale, his lips cracked, but he smiled when he saw her. He didn't ask questions, just wrapped his arms around her neck and held on. It was nearly midday when they got back to the barn. Joetta carried him the last mile. Her legs shook, but she didn't stop. Eli met them at the gate. No rifle, just a canvas bag slung over his shoulder. He said nothing, nodded once and turned toward the barn. Joetta followed without needing an invitation. Inside, the air smelled of hay, oil, and warm horse. Clem clung to her side, wide-eyed, until Eli bent and handed him a small tin cup filled with warm milk. The boy took it with both hands like it was gold. "You do chores, you eat," Eli said, not unkindly. Clem nodded, still drinking. Joetta looked at him, then really looked and saw something different. Not just a man scraping by alone, but a man who remembered what it was to feed a boy. That flicker of memory passed between them without a word. She didn't ask about the boy in the photograph. He didn't offer. Later, as the sun moved higher, Eli set Joetta to work on the east fence line. It was to test, it was a job, and she took to it with the blunt force of desperation. Her hands moved fast, efficient. She didn't wince at the splinters, didn't curse the rusted nails. She moved like someone who depatched worse in worse weather. Eli watched her for a while, then left her to it. By evening, Clem was asleep under a blanket on the porch, a half-carved wooden horse resting beside him, rough but clearly made by someone with careful hands. Joetta sat beside him, rolling her shoulders. Eli handed her a dim plate with beans, bread, and salted meat. No ceremony, just a quiet offering. They ate in silence for a while. "You from around here?" he asked finally. "No, born outside Abilene. Father moved us up north when the land dried out. Stayed till he died." She picked at her bread. "Didn't leave much behind but debts and dry tools." Eli gave a low sound, almost a hum. "Hard land," he said. She looked at him. "Any other kind?" He cracked a bear's smile. "Fair enough." A breeze stirred the dust, and the last light of day settled soft across the barn roof. It was a silence neither of them needed to break, so they didn't. But in that quiet, something shifted, something so small it barely registered. Not trust, not yet, but the shape of it, like a hand resting near another, not touching, but close enough to know it might. Inside the house, the fire waited. Clem snored lightly. The windmill creaked out back. And Joetta, for the first time in months, didn't feel like she was standing on the edge of something breaking. She was still tired, still worn thin, but she wasn't alone. And that meant something. Over the weeks that followed, the days took on the rhythm of survival, but with less desperation. Joetta rose early, sometimes before Eli, and got the fire going. Clem would shuffle in with the blanket still around his shoulders, and she'd hand him a warm cup without speaking. Eli would come in later, quiet as always, but not unkind. He'd nod to the boy, then to her, and the day would begin. The chores were endless: mending wire, hauling water, scraping muck from stalls. The land stayed hard, and the sun stayed mean. But Joetta worked like someone who had been fighting the world a long time and had just now found a place she could put both feet down. Eli noticed. He didn't say it out loud, but he didn't have to. He started setting things out before she asked, leaving tools by the fence line, an extra pair of gloves near the trough. Not instructions, just understanding. He didn't talk about himself, not at first, but sometimes in the lull of evening when Clem was asleep on a quilt near the fire, Eli would talk while peeling potatoes or mending a latch. Said he grew up near the Red Desert. Said his old man used to break horses for the army, back when there was money in that. Had a wife once, Rosalie. Sweet, quiet. Said she died in childbirth when their boy was just 8. Pneumonia got him the next winter. He didn't say their names often, but he never looked away from the memory. Joetta listened, not with questions, just with stillness. She didn't try to fix anything, didn't speak unless it helped. That was enough for him. And when she spoke finally, it wasn't all at once. Just pieces. How Cal had been charming, quick to laugh, always scheming toward a better life. How she'd followed him from county to county, waiting for the moment it would all come together. How Clem was born in the back of a wheat truck during a storm that nearly drowned the road. How, one day, Cal just stopped looking her in the eye, stopped talking the way he used to, and then he left. She said all this while tending the fire, her voice flattened even, like reading out of a ledger. But her hands shook. I didn't interrupt, just set a tin cup in front of her. Hot, strong coffee. The silence after was thick, but not heavy. They began to fall into something quieter than love, but sturdier. A way of knowing the other would still be there at sundown. That if something went wrong, a busted fence, a sick calf, A child's cough in the night, the other would already be moving. Joetta took to the land like it was her penance and her salvation. She learned to patch a saddle, learned to read the clouds like Eli did. Clem helped, where he could feeding chickens, gathering kindling, falling asleep in the hay with straw in his hair. One morning, Eli handed her the reins to his second horse. "You ride?" he asked, not testing her, just wondering. "Haven't in years," she said, mounting in one swing. "But it comes back." It did. Her spine remembered how to bend with the motion. Eli watched from the gate as she and Clem rode out to check the southern troughs. He didn't smile, not quite, but his hand lingered on the fence post longer than it needed to. That night, while Clem dozed against her shoulder and the stars turned sharp above the house, Joetta whispered, mostly to herself, "It's starting to feel real again." Eli didn't answer, but he laid another log on the fire and stayed beside her until the flames burned low, and neither of them moved. The storm came early, scraping over the ridgeline like a black freight train. The sky folded in on itself, all thunder and pressure. Joetta stood in the barn doorway with a shovel in one hand, her apron soaked through. Eli was out beyond the south pasture, trying to run the cattle, and before the lightning got close enough to bite, Clem clung to her skirt, barefoot and wide-eyed. She could smell the ozone, sharp as metal, and the wind whipped the hair from her braid. By the time Eli returned, soaked to the bone with mud streaked up his arms, the worst had passed. They lost 2 cows, found dead near the fence, stiff and still with their hides burned in patches. Eli didn't say a word, just stood over them for a long while before getting the drag rope. After, while they ate in silence, Joetta saw something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not grief, something tighter. Fear, maybe, or doubt. She didn't ask, but the storm did something else. It woke up the world beyond their little stretch of land. The next week a wagon arrived. A man stepped down. Clean shirt, boots to new for real work, and a long mouth that didn't seem used to smiling. His name was Charles Denton, and he introduced himself as Joe Ted's brother-in-law. "Cole's older brother," he said, adjusting his cuffs. "I've been looking for you." Joetta didn't move. "Why?" "Cole's dead," he said, flat and final. "Shot over a card game in Denver. Name he gave led back to you." She took it in without blinking. No tears, just the weight of it. Charles stepped closer. "Didn't come to fight. I came to fetch the boy. Got a house now, a store outside Casper. My wife, Swan, and children, and well, I figure I can give him more than what HES got out here." Eli stepped out of the barn then, silent, still, his presence heavy as a rope in the hand. Joetta looked at Charles, then at Clem, who sat on the porch rail eating an apple. "You think HES something to be passed around?" she asked low. "HES blood," Charles said, "and blood counts for more than hardship." Joetta stood straighter. "So does love." That night, after the wagon rattled away empty, she found Eli by the water trough, leaning on the fence like it held him up. "You think I was wrong to send him away?" she asked. Eli shook his head once. "No, but now it's real. HES gone, Joetta. Cow, all of it." She nodded, her arms crossed over her chest like a shield. "I didn't cry. I thought I would. You were crying long before you died." Silence hung heavy. Then Eli added, "You could have gone with him. Started over somewhere clean." She turned to him slow. "I thought about it." His jaw worked. "Why didn't you?" She took a breath that shook at the edges. "Because here I'm not surviving for someone else's dreams. I'm doing it on my own terms. For my boy. For me." They stood there, neither moving. The moon had slipped out from behind a cloud, lighting the dry field in a silver that made it seem alive. "But I need to know," she whispered. "This whatever we're building, is it real? Or are we both just patching up holes with what's left?" Eli didn't speak, just stepped closer and touched her hand, calloused palm against her fingers. I ain't good with promises," he said, "but I don't want to watch you right away." Her fingers tightened on his. "Then give me reason to stay." Neither smiled, but they didn't need to. Inside, Clem stirred in his sleep and called softly for her. Joetta pulled her hand away, but not coldly. "I should go to him." Eli nodded, still holding the space between them like a fragile thing. The storm had passed, but its mark remained. The next Sunday the preacher came riding through, dust on his coat and fire in his mouth. "Brought word that the Denton family wasn't done yet," said Charles had spoken to a county man in Casper, stirring talk of guardianship rights. Said a letter was on his way. Eli stood in the doorway after the preacher left, arms folded, eyes dark. Joetta sat at the table, staring at a chipped plate, her knuckles white around a dish towel. "They don't want me," she said. "They want what Calode." "Maybe," Eli said, "but they're willing to tear you apart to get it." Joetta stood suddenly, the chair scraping behind her. "I won't let them take him, Eli." He nodded once. "Then we fight." They spent the next few days riding into town, finding the right people, quiet ones who remembered Joetta, cleaning houses, tending old men, keeping Clem fed when no one would lend a crust. A widow near the mill signed a statement. The old shopkeeper who once traded soup bones for selling repairs gave his name too. And Eli, he rode to Casper himself, came back 2 days later with dust in his eyes and a look Joetta hadn't seen before. When he handed her the envelope, her hands shook. Inside was a deed. His land, signed over not to her, not yet, but to include her name. A joint holding with Clem listed as heir. "I ain't asking for anything," Eli said quietly. "Not your heart, not even your thanks. I'm giving you ground to stand on." She looked at him long and hard. "Why?" He met her eyes. "Because a boy needs a mother who don't have to beg to keep him. And a woman like you shouldn't have to ask for her place in the world. She ought to claim it." The hearing came and went. Charles never showed. The lawyer who had stirred the trouble wrote a brief letter of apology, citing misunderstanding and incomplete records. It didn't matter. The damage had been done and undone by grit, truth, and the slow, unshakable gathering of roots. One evening, not long after, Eli brought in a package wrapped in paper. Joetta unwrapped it slow. Inside was a pair of leather gloves, hand-stitched, worn but strong. "These were Rosalie's," Eli said. "She wore 'em working the cattle her first year. Thought they should be used again." Joetta didn't speak. She turned the gloves in her hands like they were something holy. Then she set them down, stepped forward, and kissed him. It wasn't rushed. It was desperate. It was the kind of kiss that happens when you've both seen the edge and chosen not to fall. Clem, watching from the porch steps, didn't say a word. But later, he took Ella's hand while they walked to the troughs, and neither mentioned it. The truth was simple. They were already a family. They had been for some time. They had just now said it out loud. The wind changed by late spring. You could smell the thaw coming down from the hills, the snow pushing through dry creeks that hadn't carried water in years. It was subtle, but it mattered. Eli called it a shift in the bones of the land. Joetta just called it hope. They moved slow, careful. Eli cleared out the back room for Clem without being asked. Joetta started keeping 2 loaves on the stove instead of 1. Nothing needed naming. They all just lived a little closer to each other. One morning, while fixing the gate that kept sagging by the corral, Eli reached into his coat pocket and handed Joetta something wrapped in cloth. It wasn't a ring. It was a key. "The house is yours," he said. "Ours, if you want it to be." Joetta didn't cry. She just took the key and pressed it into her palm until she felt it mark her. A week later, Clem brought in a lizard HED cop, proud as anything. Joetta made him let it go. That night, he asked if Eli could teach him to ride a horse on his own. Eli didn't answer right away, just nodded and said, "We'll start in the morning." That same night, after Clem had gone to bed and the fire burned low, Joetta stood at the sink, drying the same plate twice. "I'm pregnant," she said. Eli looked up from the chair, caught off guard but only for a second. He crossed the room without saying anything, set his hands on her hips, and pressed his forehead against hers. "You sure?" he whispered. She nodded. "Didn't plan it. Didn't expect it. But I'm not afraid of it." He kissed her then, soft and long, and the silence that followed wasn't emptiness, it was fullness, like the sound of a field in bloom. By early summer, the house was patched, the windows cleaned, a new clothesline strung from post to post. Joetta kept her garden in rows. Eli carved a cradle out of cedar HED saved from a tree fallen years before. On Sundays, Clem walked beside Joetta to the far hill, where they could see the whole spread. He pointed out calves and fences and named clouds after things they all remembered trips to town. Ellie's soup on cold days, the time the rooster chased him halfway to the barn. One evening, as the sun stretched long over the grass, Joetta sat on the porch rail, a hand resting on the round of her belly. Eli was mending a bit of tack, Clem asleep under a blanket with one hand curled around his carved horse. "You think it'll hold?" she asked. Eli looked up. "What?" "This life." He studied her a moment, then looked at the boy, the land, the light. "It already is." A hush fell across the yard, broken only by the creak of the windmill and the whisper of wind through prairie grass. In that moment the land felt not just survivable but generous. The ranch house stood firm behind them. The night came on gentle, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called, not in hunger, not in mourning, but like it had found its place. So had they. Subscribe and keep the long ride alive.